Policy moves fast. Providers need clarity. That's why we go above the noise.
Well, good day and welcome to the second episode of Above the Noise. My name is Ed Marasco, and I'll be hosting this edition. Of course, Above the Noise is one component of the Ames on Air podcast series. We understand that policymaking and other things in the industry move really fast, and providers need clarity and updates. And that's why we go above the noise to provide this important industry information, updates, and insights for those who are part of the critical care transport community. With that brief introduction, let's jump right in. I'd like to really do the main introductions, which is to introduce you to our guest today. I have the privilege of serving as the vice chair of the Ames Government Affairs Committee, and my colleague Chris Hall is the chair of the Ames Government Affairs Committee, and he's been an active member of the GA community for decades. I hope I get that right, Chris. I know it's been a long time. You and I have worked together on a bunch of projects, and so happy to have you on board today. How are you, and what's new in your world, Chris?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Great to see you again. What's new in our world is in February, we moved back up to Oregon, and so we're now in the Central Oregon area. What's great is that my wife Amy and I were surrounded by our family. We have our older children with my oldest daughter and her kids, our oldest son with his girlfriend, and then our younger son and our grandson are living with us. And then here in the next couple of weeks, we'll be moving back our oldest daughter from Oklahoma. So we'll have the whole family back together right in the middle of Oregon with family in all directions. So it's a great place to be. Weather's beautiful. I step outside and see the Cascades every morning that I get up and step out the door. Happy to be here. And thanks for having me as part of this conversation. I appreciate you and appreciate the good work that our team here does.
Yeah, that's all good news, Chris. I'm sure Amy is extremely pleased.
Yes, very much so. Yes.
Good. Well, thank you very much for the update. Mr. Sanders, Kyle Sanders, brings a decade of public service experience to our partners at Thorn Run, which include his most recent assignment as a senior aide, deputy chief of staff to Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina. And he's been our main go-to guy here in our partnership with Thorn Run, he and Shay McCarthy. And so, Kyle, how are you today, and what's going on in your world?
I'm doing great. I don't have anything as monumental as a move across the country to report on, fortunately, but my weekends are dotted with toddler birthday parties, so maybe equally as exciting in their own right. I will report that I'm happy it's a recess week. We can explain that further for folks that might be new to the program, but that means just basically Congress is in the district and state, which means they're away from DC and allow us to get caught up on our inbox. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you very much for that update. And as I mentioned, Shay McCarthy is our other partner from Thorn Run, and he's a respected lobbyist, a healthcare policy analyst, communication expert. We do rely on Shay an awful lot to put our messaging together. And so we are delighted to have him back on the podcast. Shay, how are you doing this week since it's a recess week?
It's good to be back, Ed. Now, talking about family life, my daughter just went through her first communion at home, so a lot to celebrate, a lot of family time these days, but life is good, and we're all ready for the summer.
Congratulations. That's good news. Well, let's jump right into the first segment. It's what we call our What's Happening in DC segment. And so we try to explore a little bit about what's happening. And as the guys mentioned, it's recess right now, but leading up to recess, it's been pretty busy. Can you guys fill us in on what's transpiring in DC these days?
Well, Kyle, I'm happy to start with that one, and as always, I'll welcome your 2 cents. I mean, Ed, let's just level set here. We are a little over halfway now through what has been maybe the most dysfunctional Congress in recent history, and it seems like a trend because they always find a way to top themselves, and the numbers kind of speak for themselves when it comes to this 119th Congress. We have had the longest full government shutdown in history of 43 days. We've had the longest single agency shutdown in the Department of Homeland Security, which lasted for over 70 days. And I think Congress is just trying to figure out at this point whether they can do business as usual. Now is the time where they go through the bipartisan appropriations process and hash out these big spending packages. And this is sort of job one as a member of Congress is when your fundamental responsibility is to at least figure out how to continue to fund the programs that do exist and at what level. So that's Congress's primary responsibility right now. We're in the middle of an election year, and that means that for members of Congress, there's a lot of distractions outside of Washington, whether it's the redistricting going on in their districts or the primary campaigns they're running, and then some of them are gearing up for their general elections. There's something else on each of their minds, but when it comes to what they're doing in DC, can they get their act together and actually go through what is supposed to be a relatively routine process of government spending? Those are the things that a lot of lawmakers are spending their time on right now. And, the one thing that I like to keep an eye on, because the House and Senate floor, I'd say don't leave a ton of room for optimism. There's not a whole lot of bipartisan policies that are moving forward in an election year. That's pretty typical. But on the other hand, we are seeing the action behind the scenes where it really matters, the committees of jurisdiction, congressional caucuses, individual priorities being elevated. And so, you know, I wouldn't say that the progress in Washington is happening fast and furious, at least at a public level right now, but members are still advancing their individual bills by working through their committees. They're still working to gain co sponsors, and that's one of the things that Ames is focused on a handful of our priorities. And so the truth is that there's probably not a ton to show for themselves as far as accomplishments for the next couple months. But ultimately, we're expecting to see big spending packages culminate at some point over the summer, and then ultimately towards the end of the year, get over the finish line. And Congress is laying a lot of that groundwork as we speak.
Interesting. Kyle, anything from your
Yeah, and I'll
perspective?
I'll just add, we're increasingly creeping close to that election cycle that Shay mentioned, and as the days drag on closer to summer, what tends to occur is that leadership in either party can get a bit entrenched in their positioning to not negotiate because the uh, at the end of the day, they don't want to be seen as giving the other political party a win, even if it's a bipartisan one. So one thing that we keenly watch for, Shay mentioned this too, is what's happening behind the scenes, behind closed doors. What sort of negotiating posture committee staff have, what members are pushing which priorities. Because while activity may stall the closer we get to November, the lame duck cycle is pretty active, can be, and we want to make sure that anything that's been percolating between now and then is typically tends to be ripe to move in a lame duck session. Lame duck session is a session that occurs after the election, but before new members are sworn in January. So that time frame around Thanksgiving through the holidays can be very busy. So we want to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of what could happen, because while it might get quiet between now and the election, it could be a relatively busy time here toward the holidays.
Yeah, and I give you guys a lot of credit because there's a lot of moving parts, and you guys do a great job of sort of keeping track and also keeping us in the loop. So thank you for that update. We appreciate it, and I'm sure the listeners will appreciate sort of that perspective. Let's move on to our Government Affairs 101 section. This is where we try and talk about um, things that our listeners should know about the process, right? And so I wanted to pick your brains a little bit about a topic that we talk regularly about on the Government Affairs call, and I just had a conversation with another colleague from the ground ambulance industry about this, and that is um, what do we mean when we encourage members to participate in relationship building, to get ahead of those relationships before we have an ask, right? Why is that so important?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll jump in, and please, Shay, Chris, let me know what I missed. But at the when you're engaging with Congress, there are at any given moment hundreds, thousands of competing priorities, interests, and stakeholders, right? The last thing you want to do is introduce yourself to a staffer for the first time or a member with your hair on fire with an emergency. So what we encourage and what we do is foster these relationships for ourselves to be effective consultants, for our clients to be useful when they need them. But those can look a lot of different ways depending on the stakeholder. For with our Ames hat on, what's been really fascinating and great to watch is how engaged our members are with their members in local districts. And what I mean by that is when we talk about these extended recess periods where members of Congress are not in DC, they're back in their states or districts, we've had a really good showing from our member companies, our member organizations, soliciting different members of Congress and senators to come to bases in their districts. And that's a great opportunity to get face time with members, sort of in a low stakes environment where you're not typically suit and tie. It's a little more informal, the opportunity to, I think, connect with people is a little stronger. That's been one asset, one value I've seen our members deploy in terms of engagement. But it could be as simple as regular updates with staff who you have fostered a relationship with, that you've met once or twice, coming up for Hill visits through our organization and our fly-in days. Ed, anything that's germane, we look for opportunities to stay in people's inboxes and on their minds. It looks a little different from our seat. Shay and I, Shay does a great job of hosting happy hours for healthcare staffers on the Hill, for instance. Not to steal your thunder, Shay, but things like that. We try to have lunches, coffees, dinners with these folks so that at the end of the day, they're friends of ours. And then when we go in and ask for either favors or intelligence or support, it's not some stranger off the street coming in, it's somebody they know. And that's why we think the relationship management and fostering peace is just so critical to the overall strategy.
And these elected officials, Kyle, their job is to represent the employees, the employers, the constituents that make up the economy in their districts. And so this old trope that all politics are local, um, it kind of it applies so directly to what we do in government affairs. And it's why, as lobbyists in Washington, we're not always going to be the best messenger. We rely heavily on whether it's the geographic footprint or hopefully the relationships that our members create with the lawmakers in their geographic footprint when telling any member of Congress why they should care. Uh, so with that in mind, it goes a long way towards finding the right messenger to develop a relationship. And at the staff level, to Kyle's point, we can hobnob with the people in DC, but who are they elected to represent? It's the employees, the employers, the constituents, the patients back in their district. And so understanding the impact that your individual organization has, and even if it's just one member of Congress and maybe one or both senators that represent the state, that represent the territory that you live in, if you're kind of doing some of the bare minimum of government affairs in developing those relationships up front, then when you do face some sort of issue that you could use the support of a federal official, that's one or two warm phone calls that you're able to make. And so relationship building that we do up front, that's what translates into the asks that we're very likely to have to make at some point in the future.
You know, it's a great question. I'll chime in here. Shay and I just got back from MTLI a couple weeks ago, and we had some conversation about this at grad school, and it was a great opportunity for Shay to say exactly what he said, but even more detail. And it's true that what Kyle said about not wanting to show up, in the urgency of the moment and have to ask for, particular action. Fortunately, we see this at the state level, as you know, that states move very fast. And sometimes you do get that call where you find out that, oh my gosh, this bill's going to drop. And now you do have to run there real quick. And it usually makes things a little bit more challenging, as you know, because you're going there, you're introducing yourself, you're not known, and now you're having to educate somebody really fast to help them understand what they're about to do. Sometimes it's just unavoidable. But in the best case scenario, when we can get in there early, and Shay mentioned this at MTLI, building these relationships, sometimes we're benefited by having a team like Throne Run Partners who have the connections. They can open up doors for us and get us where we need to go. But some of the grassroots stuff we do back at home, we don't need a lobbyist for. It's just a matter of going into that district office, introducing yourself, saying hello, and letting them know who you are and what you do for the district, and then making the invitation over to the base. And that sort of it's a low effort, but a huge reward task, if you will. And it starts out the relationship, and they know who you are walking in the door. Then.
Hmm. Yeah, Chris, you've had pretty good success with this over the years, as I recall. How common is it that the staffers or even the congressmen themselves accept your invitation to come by the base? Is that something that is pretty well received?
You know, it's we've had a lot of successes over the years. It takes a lot of work to be the polite squeaky wheel. I see Kyle nodding here. These folks are extremely busy. You know, their schedules aren't their own, which probably sounds familiar to our listeners. And so there are times though when they're going to be back in their district. And so when you start laying the groundwork a couple months ahead of time, the goal is to get on their calendar, and usually that's through their scheduler, either in the district or with a little bit of an assist from DC calling home and saying this is important. But what's really gratifying is whether you get the district staff member or the member themselves, either opportunity, your message is going to be heard by the member. And either way, somebody, either the member or the staff member, is going to see the service you provide, meet your folks, and have a good understanding of what's going on. And so it's a great event. If you can get the member there, it's really truly a good event for them to see, what work is being done, and also for the folks at your base or your location to meet the person they may have voted for. And even if they didn't vote for them, they get a chance to see them and put a name to a face. Kyle or Shay, you want to jump in there?
Well, yeah, Chris, it's a great photo op for them. So you have to realize it is a mutually beneficial relationship. They benefit from getting to know their constituents, um, from doing things that look pretty cool and high profile on camera, but they're never going to make it there if you don't make the ask and you don't start by initiating, likely at the staff level, that relationship. It's also not as hard as it sounds. Keeping a relationship with a congressional office might look like one meeting over Zoom in the first quarter of the year, and then one email every 3 months or so. So, like a quarterly touch point to tell them what's new in the industry, what's new with your business. That's enough to be a familiar name in their inbox so that, when that next thing comes up in the future, they're part of your Rolodex. Again, I like to emphasize it. We're tasked as government affairs professionals with maintaining relationships with dozens and dozens of legislators, but an entry point into this is finding one or two congressional offices where you have a physical presence and getting on their radar.
I'll I'll
Yeah.
I'll chime in. Shay said something that got my attention, Ed. About the cool things that they get to see when they come to the base. It's been my experience that for our listeners, most of the members and even their staff, they either know someone who's been transported by an air ambulance or a ground ambulance, or they may have been transported themselves. But even then, they know very little about what it takes to run a medical transport service, whether it's air or ground or critical care or emergency services generally. And so when you can get them to the base, you're really giving them an opportunity to educate themselves and understand more than what they might see on TV or what they might have heard second or third hand. So, Kyle, sorry, I jumped in ahead of you. Kyle, go ahead.
No, you guys have done a good job. I got nothing else to add here.
Yeah, and thanks. One thing I took away from that conversation too is it doesn't necessarily matter if the member is there, but if there's someone representing the office, that message, the information that you're sharing, is going to make its way back to the staff, the appropriate staff person, and the members. So, thank you for that. I'm glad that, because sometimes it feels like, oh well, if you don't get the congressman there, it's not really worth it. But you guys are saying that it is, because the information does get back, and I love the photo op sort of point as well, Shay. It's great for them, right? Well, thank you. Anything else on that topic that you guys wanted to share at this point before we move on to our sort of feature segment?
All good.
All
Good,
good here.
super guys. Thank you. Well, there was an in-person gathering in DC about a month or so ago now, maybe a little bit more at this point, which focused on assessing the progress of the Ames government affairs efforts and establishing some priorities for the future. So let's kind of jump in with the basics. Chris and team, uh, how well was it attended? How did it go?
Ed, thanks again for teeing this up. It was a great conversation. We've done this, I want to say, every year. It's usually in the first quarter. This year, with activity being what it is in Congress, it slipped to the beginning of March, so a little bit later in the first quarter, but still a worthwhile exercise. This is really our opportunity where we get together members, whoever can be there, and you don't have to have a lobbyist in order to attend. But we gather at the Ames office. We have a good room, good facility to do this there in Alexandria. We're not very far away from DC. And we have Kyle and Shay join us, and anybody else they'd like to bring from Thorn Run Partners who could be a part of the conversation. And really, the goal here is to look at what have we done over the last year, what went well, what could we improve upon, and then what are the priorities moving forward in this next year. They may be the same priorities, just a different approach, or maybe the same priorities, just a different discussion about what things look like this year with a different landscape to work within. Um, Shay and Kyle know it more than I do. Every 2 years, the landscape changes in Congress. We could see, control of the House or control of the Senate change. Every 4 years, we might see a change in the administration. So it's really important to gather everybody together and talk about what things look like, level set, and see where we go from there. Very well attended. I would say we had the room full. I think Kyle or Shay probably, I want to say about 40 people altogether for most of the day. And then usually on the shoulders of that meeting, either the day or the before or the day after, we'll have Hill meetings where we'll go meet with staff. And if we're fortunate, we'll be able to meet with a member. And what's really nice there is if we have some folks, if we do the legwork ahead of time and get the invitations in or get the meeting requests in, we usually have the opportunity to meet with one or two members. And this last exercise was particularly helpful because that's when we got to meet with Congressman Zinke and Congresswoman Takuda and got to launch the Air Medical Caucus. So, Kyle or Shay, do you want to chime in on our strategic meeting?
Yeah, I thought it went really well, Chris. It's always a good, just to zoom out, it's a good time to touch gloves with everybody in one place to see how are we doing on the things we talked about last year? Are we advancing the ball in our priorities? And what is new? What's changed since we last spoke? What was notable to me, this conversation, we spent a lot of time on safety, as you know. That's on the tip of everyone's tongue and certainly the top of everyone's mind, both in Congress and in our industry. We want to enhance safety. We only function if we are being as safe as possible. We care for our patients is prime, right? That's all we really focus on. Operating safely is an important piece of that. The administration and more importantly, I think Congress has taken a key interest in this topic, given some of the incidents we are very well aware of. The DCA mid-air collision being a bit of a catalyst for legislation in this space. So our visit to DC, our industry visit to DC was very timely. We sat down with some committees of jurisdiction working on safety legislation and got to insert ourselves in that conversation. But for our advocacy and engagement, we would not be offered a seat at the table at some of these advisory commissions and councils that are being contemplated by Congress. So a very fruitful visit. Again, safety was top of mind for us. It always is, but it's now a huge priority for the Congress and will continue to be for the foreseeable future.
Ed, another thing that we talked about a little bit that I think from the strategy side, us government affairs folks think about a lot is what levers do we have to pull? You take a look at advocacy and government relations, and you assume it always means trying to get a bill across the finish line. And it's true, we do have some real legislative priorities, some bills that we would love to see get signed into law. But that's not the only way to move the needle. And a lot of times when we're looking at the various challenges facing the industry, we're looking at other ways that we can impose some influence, that we can maybe impact the administration's perspective, and they can use some of the authority that they have without having to go through Congress. And that means that if you've got friends in Congress that are looking to help you, especially if they're in the same party as the one that is in the White House, you can maybe find a workaround to your solution rather than trying to push a bill through both chambers of Congress. Get those supportive members to weigh in on your behalf with the administration, or to figure out what departments and agencies are responsible for implementing certain rules and regulations that you're invested in. So there's a lot of strategic thinking that goes into how we're spending our time. And that doesn't always just mean go knock on as many doors on Capitol Hill as possible to gain co-sponsors to get a bill to pass. It can also mean things that are a little bit more subtle and nuanced, whether it's writing a letter, trying to get a phone call in, working the right agencies, grassroots engagement. There are a really multifaceted number of ways that we kind of incorporate the tools that we have in our toolbox to supporting the industry from an advocacy perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. And along the lines of strategy, since we sort of gravitated into that, were there any common themes from the discussion last month that, from a strategy perspective, that we want to share?
I
Well,
think
if
we
we could do a
really
little
look.
bit of a callback, Ed, it starts with engagement, right? It starts with those relationships that we talked about at the top of the call and calling on some of those folks. Shay has done a fantastic job interfacing with the administration directly on some of our priorities. I'll toot his horn because he's not often the one to do it for him, but leveraging the members that we have these relationships with, whether it's based off of sort of this organic nexus geographically where you've had these members in your bases and your districts and you've used them, or if it just happens to be members that sit on committees of jurisdiction that oversee issues we care about, having those folks weigh into the administration on topics is also an effective strategy. So it's a bit of a top down and bottom up strategy. I would call it with engagement, but you've got to do more than just one thing to be effective in DC. It can't just be, well, at least in most cases, it's not as straightforward as that.
Ed, I think the theme that I would go with is the three values that Ames has: the advocacy, collaboration, and education. It's not three different silos there, with advocacy just being GA. All three of those come into play with our strategic planning. So it's advocacy of getting out and talking. Then there's the collaboration of working with other associations in the space to be able to have a unified message, or at least an aligned message. And then the education of going around and talking not just to our members, but to the members in Congress and their staff about what we're doing, so that folks understand. This is never a 8 to 5 job for Ames, and especially for Kyle and Shay. It's a constant turn. And as soon as you're done with one task, you go back to the start of that task and start all over again. So I'm really happy to say that when it comes to this advocacy piece, Ames is engaged a lot. And while you may not see the product constantly coming out of the office, it's like the duck on the water, that it looks calm on the top, but underneath the feet keep turning.
Feet are churning. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me again, since Shay is not wanting to do this very frequently, but let me just share just some traffic from the last couple weeks. We've had some questions from members about how we're weighing in on certain issues and what we've done, as well as other associations that we partner with and collaborate with, as Chris pointed out. And Shay, you've done a great job putting together a couple of one pagers to help us communicate where we are and what's important to us. And so again, all that activity under the surface of the water, right, is very important because it keeps the top of the water we're cruising in the right direction. So thank you for that. Um, we talk a lot about data collection as a part of our advocacy efforts. Was there any conversation about that aspect of it as the gang was together last month?
I'm glad you teed
Yeah,
that up.
we go ahead,
Chris,
Shay.
you can
Hop in.
jump in on this too, but this was top of mind for me. It was something that came up a lot during the discussion, Ed, and data collection is it's almost hard to understate what a core component it is of advocacy, because it's what gives the anecdotal information, and it's what gives perspective to the policy positions that we're taking. It gives it all credibility when we have data that supports the message that we're pushing on Capitol Hill. It's one thing, for example, to go up to Congress and tell them that Medicare is only paying us about 50% of the cost of a typical air ambulance transport. And, when the industry comes to Capitol Hill with their hand open, it's easy for a member of Congress or their staff to turn a skeptical eye. But what's jarring is when you see a statistic like that is truly supported by the data, and that can serve as a real wake-up call to policymakers that there's a problem that we need to fix. And this just isn't another example of a boy who cried wolf and one more stakeholder that's finding a way to nudge their reimbursement upwards. When you're able to show directly the impact that it could have on access, the impact that policies could happen on cash flow, um, data means that we're putting our money where our mouth is from a policy perspective. And we invest very heavily, both Ames doing industry backed data collection and also supporting the federal government to do more data collection of their own. Because the way that we see it, the more the Medicare agency understands the cost dynamics of our industry, the more it's going to support our calls for revisiting our reimbursement, for improving our ability to provide care. And it really supports the industry's interests. So data collection has been a key priority. Chris, you can speak to this as well as anyone.
Yeah. So moving ahead with the data conversation, I think that Shay captured all of it. The toughest part is the exercise itself. We have folks who need the data. We know we have an audience for the data. But the tough part is sometimes gathering the data. And so, Ames does a lot of outreach there. We've got a firm, Dobson DeVonzo, that's doing some outreach there. And we really want to encourage folks to be able to submit that data in this exercise and then also in future ones, because as Shay said, every time we go to the Hill or every time we have a policy conversation, the more data we can point to, and not just anecdotes, but the more data folks are willing to share, the better supports Ames and Ames's ability to represent its membership and paint the picture that needs to be painted for the members to understand what exactly it looks like back home.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Shay, as well. Um, Obviously, being able to put some data behind the message is always more well received. So, any closing thoughts as you reflect back on the strategic planning session? And there's been some, we've had some progress since then. There's always issues happening. Thoughts from around the room here on what's next for us.
Well, I'll kick it off here and I'll turn over to Kyle and Shay. First off, I'm very grateful to the Ames leadership, Jana and team, and then the other associations that have worked so well together in current times. It's refreshing to see, and for that, I'm grateful. We're making some steady progress. It's always incremental progress. Nothing in Congress moves as fast as we would like it to. Certainly, it moves faster in the states at times, but even then, the coalitions, the getting people together to get everyone pointing in the same direction is always a value. So, my appreciation to Jana and to the other leaders of the other associations in the space for having the ability to sit down, have these conversations, and help us move forward in one direction. It does a lot more than when there's conflict, and we don't get as much done. Um, I think that for Kyle and Shay, I'm always appreciative of their insights they bring to it, of the value of Thorn Run Partners. When Ames brought on Thorn Run Partners, it really did provide us a lot of bipartisan access that we hadn't had before. And I think that, just the Thorn Run Partners has been around long enough that it really is a force multiplier for Ames in the efforts. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Shay or to Kyle for their thoughts to answer your question.
Yeah, you said force multiplier, Ed. When I leave those strategy sessions, I'm always inspired by how many sophisticated professionals we have in our broader family and coalition. And they really truly are a force multiplier as well. It's not just the people you see in boxes right now that are up pushing initiatives, it's a broader coalition. And we really benefit from having stakeholders similarly aligned, pushing the messages that matter. That's one of the things I always walk away just pleasantly surprised, not surprised, pleased with, because, you know, from the outside looking in, you might not know that. And we are, we do benefit from a lot of different stakeholders with different interests, but we've always coalesce around the ideas that matter to the industry and are able to push those on multiple fronts.
Yeah, Kyle, that's sort of a segue into exactly what I was thinking. And for me, these get togethers really help us stay focused. They are one of many ways that we are able to sort of get feedback and hear directly from some of the most engaged members of AIMS on what is driving the day for them from a policy perspective. In Washington, we could be chasing a different squirrel on a different healthcare issue every single week if every little thing that um, Ames could potentially weigh it on, I should say, is something that we decided to spend our time on.
Mhm.
We've got a very defined set of priorities, and we know what makes the most meaningful impact for our members. I think we heard that loud and clear during the strategy session, whether it's reimbursement, whether it's implementation of IDR and the new regulations that are impacting their commercial sector negotiations, whether it's safety related issues. We hear a lot about that during these sessions. And while we have a general sense of direction, we also sort of know what the atmosphere is that we're living in. And it gives us a good sense for whether the next thing that comes down the pipe, is this something that fits into those priorities and should be taken seriously? Or is this something that other stakeholders are similarly focused on and Ames's voice isn't especially unique, and maybe we don't spend our energy and resources there. So the focus that we get out of these sort of strategic discussions really frame the way that I think we all operate when we're running 100 miles an hour throughout the year, figuring out how we can be most productive.
Yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen, for that perspective. And it's been a pleasure to have our government affairs dream team present for this session. With Chris and Shay and Kyle in this episode, we're able to get into some of the key issues and talk about, what lies ahead and how we prioritize things for the association. Thank you to each of you for taking the time to join us and share so much meaningful insight. And that's a great segue into sort of our "What's Up Next" segment. So when we gather for the next episode, we'll have an opportunity to take a deep dive into some of these key issues that are faced by the community and what actions the industry and the association are taking. As always, thank you to the listeners for joining us. We appreciate you being a part of this second episode of Above the Noise. We're excited to be able to bring you some of the latest insights from the team at Ames. And please, we welcome your feedback, and we look forward to continuing to provide the information that you need to be successful.
Thanks for listening to Ames on Air. Today's Above the Noise panel highlighted current issues across air medical and critical care ground transport. Policy moves fast, providers need clarity. That's why we go above the noise. Subscribe in your podcast app and visit the Ames on Air page at aams.org for show notes and links. See you next time.